Do you ever feel like your story's already decided? Like one chapter's ruined the whole book? In Acts chapter 3, one healing cracks open a bigger story, and it raises a question that hits all of us. Who gets written out and who gets a new chapter? Let's talk about it. Hey, welcome back. I'm Chris, the pastor at Compass. As always, I'm so glad you're with me. So a journalist knocks on your door for an appointment that you set up earlier in the week. They're writing a book on the lives of normal people in your community, and they asked you for an interview. And you said yes. So sitting across from you in your living room, they set a voice recorder on the coffee table, they hit record, and they say, "Tell me your story." So suddenly, everything in your life has to fit into 5 minutes. What do you tell them? Where do you even start? Birth? Conception? I mean, hopefully not conception, but maybe your story starts with a dream, the career you wanted or the life you pictured. Or it starts with a tragedy, the phone call, diagnosis, or a funeral. Maybe it starts with love or the breakup that wrecked you. Your life is millions of moments, but you don't share them all. You share the ones that explain you, the weird, funny, precious, devastating moments that explain who you are and how you got here. Your story doesn't just contain an account of what has happened to you, but what you think will happen to you, where you want your story to go. If the journalist asked where you would be in 5, 10, 20 years, what would you say then? What trajectory are your past and present aiming toward? Do you see a future you're excited about or a future you're trying to survive? Well, in Acts chapter 3, the story of one good deed, the healing of a man who'd never walked, it forces a crowd to face that exact question. Now, after the healing of this man born lame, we find Peter addressing the gathered crowd about what it means. And it meant this: Jesus was at the center. And Peter says that this is what God's offering: forgiveness, refreshment, and restoration. He's been telling a story about what's happening in their present and what's coming in their future. But when Peter pivots to the story of their past, things get interesting. He's not changing subjects. Rather, he's explaining what just happened by reminding the people of who they've always been. Because if you don't know the story of where you came from, you won't recognize the moment you're in right now or where you're headed. So let's just talk about this in Acts chapter 3:22. Peter says, "Moses said, 'The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among your own people. Listen carefully to everything he tells you.' Then Moses said, 'Anyone who will not listen to the prophet will be completely cut off from God's people.' And starting with Samuel, every prophet spoke about what's happening today. For God said to Abraham, 'Through your descendants, all the families on earth will be blessed.'" Now, when you started watching this, I'm willing to bet you weren't thinking, "Oh man, I sure hope Chris is going to do a deep dive into like some Old Testament stuff. Really, dig into the patriarchs and prophets of ancient Israel." Well, when you commit to working your way through a book of the Bible verse by verse, like we're doing with Acts, it's not always the downhill thrill of big miracles and inspiring parables. Sometimes it is the uphill climb of Old Testament theology. But don't check out just yet. There's background to this story that we need to understand if we're going to make sense of what just happened in the healing of this man born lame. And let me be super clear. Peter isn't preaching Old Testament theology here. He's telling a story. It's the story of Israel. Now, today we treat religion like it's a set of ideas to debate or rules to follow, but Israel didn't. For them, Scripture was the unfinished story of their past, present, and future, starting with where they came from, moving towards what God would do next. And in the middle of explaining how a lame man had been healed because of Jesus, Peter pivots to the ancient story of Israel, a story that began with Abraham. We meet Abraham in a world that feels spiritually abandoned. I mean, the cities are full and altars are plenty, but nobody knows the real God anymore. There are gods people worship, but the God of creation is basically unknown until he reintroduces himself to the world. Not through a big display of power, though, but through an invitation to one person. Let's check it out in Genesis 12, 1-3. "The Lord had said to Abraham, 'Leave your native country, your relatives, and your father's family, and go to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you and make you famous, and you will be a blessing to others. I will bless those who bless you and curse those who treat you with contempt. All the families on earth will be blessed through you. This is where the real story of Israel began. God steps into the wreckage of the world and he says to one obscure guy, let's start over. One man would become a family. That family would become a nation. And through that nation, God would begin restoring the world. But Abraham's story wasn't the whole story. In fact, as far as founding fathers go, his story was hit or miss. He did leave to go where God led, but in the 25 years before his wife got pregnant with their first child, he told the Pharaoh of Egypt that she was his sister, and he gave her to him as a concubine in order to save his own skin. He forced a servant to have sex with him to get her pregnant because he was worried it would never happen with his wife. And then, after his wife did finally give birth, he sent that servant and her teenage son away, just all off on their own. Abraham is not a clean hero, but this is important because the story was never about perfect people. It was about a faithful God moving history forward, even though they weren't heroic. Abraham was the beginning of the story of Israel, God's covenant with one man that became a family. That's what Peter first talks about. But the story didn't end there. Peter also mentioned Moses. Abraham's family multiplied, generations stacked on generations, until one day, God's promise actually looked like a prison. When history found the people of Israel as slaves in Egypt, they were a nation, but they were a nation in bondage, not blessing. Until God called Moses to lead them out of slavery into the land he'd promised Abraham. The exodus out of bondage in Egypt, it became a defining part of the story of Israel. That they are God's people, and he is the one who sets them free. And Moses was the central figure in that part of their story, which makes what God spoke through Moses, what Peter referenced and repeated to the crowds, so important. And we can see that kind of originally spoken in Deuteronomy 18:15. It says, the Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you, from your fellow Israelites. You must listen to him. I will put my words in his mouth. He will tell them everything I command him. Now, in Acts chapter 3, when Peter quotes Moses, he's not playing Bible trivia. He's saying this. He's saying Moses' chapter is the backbone of our story, but it points to an even better chapter that we haven't gotten to yet. You see, through Moses, God told the people of Israel that someone else was going to come on the scene and move the story forward. And while Moses became Israel's greatest prophet and leader, his story was also complicated. He beat a guy to death. He had an anger problem that created difficulties with other people and with God. And even though Moses led the nation of Israel to the next step of God's promise, his story also ended before it was fully fulfilled. But remember, Peter isn't telling Abraham or Moses' story. He's telling Israel's story that started with a promise to one man who became a family, that became a nation enslaved, that was then freed into a land of their own. This was the defining story of the people of Israel. It shaped their identity, how they saw the world. It shaped how they understood God and their relationship to him. And this wasn't theory to them. It was their family history. And these shared experiences shaped the story that they were living out in their present day when Peter was talking to them. But the story also didn't end there, because their past and present combined into the story of the future that they were hoping for. So Peter mentioned Abraham and Moses, but he also mentioned Samuel and the other prophets that came before, who also spoke of a time when God's promise to Abraham was going to be fulfilled, and when someone would arise to finish that story. When the promise that they would be a nation that would bless the whole world was going to come true. When the God who set them free from oppression in Egypt would set them free again from Roman oppression. When their promised land would once again be theirs under the rule of a prophet and king that Moses and Samuel and all the other prophets said was going to come. If their history defined their identity, these promises defined their hope for the future. They knew their story wasn't done yet, and they were looking for the climax. This was a hope Peter tapped into when he said this next in Acts chapter 3:25. You are the children of those prophets, and you are included in the covenant God promised to your ancestors. Peter's saying, look, God identified and he defined you by what he did in and through Abraham and Moses and Samuel and the prophets, and you are the children of the promises he made to them, to give you a future of freedom, wholeness, and blessing to the rest of the world. You see, Peter just retold the story that defined them, their past, their hope, their identity. And then he said, the ending you've been waiting for, it isn't a date or a kingdom or a revolution. It's a person. Look what he said in Acts 3:26. When God raised up his servant, Jesus, he sent him first to you people of Israel to bless you by turning each of you back from your sinful ways. Peter looks at them and he says, this thing you've been hoping for, the thing God said he was going to do through Abraham and Moses and Samuel and Isaiah and the prophets, it happened. It's here now. And it happened in Jesus. This is what Peter's telling them and us. Get this. Your story isn't finished, and Jesus isn't finished with you. Jesus is the fulfillment, the chapter it's all been heading toward. Peter retold the story that defined who the people of Israel were, right? Their identity, hurts, hopes, dreams. And then he says this, that chapter you've been waiting for, it's Jesus, his death, his resurrection, and his restoration of all creation. Now, I'll be honest, when we start talking about the Old Testament like we have been today, and the prophets and all of this stuff, it's easy to just glaze over, right? Like, that's cool, but I got anxiety, rent, a breakup, a family mess, and I got a phone that won't stop reminding me of how behind I am. It's understandable if this all seems irrelevant, because it's someone else's defining story, not mine. And I've been there. I've had moments where I thought, what does any of this have to do with Monday morning? With bills and email and anxiety, trying to make a relationship work. And if you felt that, you're not alone. But their story echoes in each of ours. God enters into a fallen and broken world that barely knows him, and he reveals himself through one man. Only this time, it's not Abraham, it's Jesus. He sets people free from slavery and bondage to sin, and he teaches the world what it really means to know God. Only this time, it's not Moses. It's Jesus. He whispers to us of a final restoration of all things that's already begun when every tear is wiped away and heaven and earth come together and God and his children are finally reunited. Only this time, it's not Samuel or the prophets speaking. It's Jesus. What Jesus is to Israel, he is to all of us. Freedom, hope, the fulfillment of God's love, mercy, and grace. Our settings and characters may not look the same as theirs, but it's the same story. The story God told through Israel, he is now telling through Jesus and through every life Jesus touches. And in Jesus, the story of Israel, it becomes your story too. You may think your story is too small or too damaged to be part of this big one. Like, you don't know the things I've done, Chris, or where I've been or what I've done with my life. My story would be edited out of all this. Abraham wasn't edited out because of his horrible treatment of his wife, his servant, and son. Moses wasn't edited out because he killed a man. In fact, they became main defining characters in spite of those things. Because just like Peter has been showing us all along in Acts 3, Jesus came so that we could be forgiven, refreshed in God, and restored. So it doesn't matter what you've done. The people Peter was addressing, they were complicit in Jesus' crucifixion, and yet they were invited to be part of what God was doing because Jesus died for all of us, not just the best of us. Israel's story didn't end. It became a person, and his name is Jesus. Your story isn't done either. Some of you have already decided how your story ends. You've labeled yourself, defined yourself by a chapter that went wrong, a failure, a betrayal, a season where you stopped praying, a relationship you detonated, a secret you hope never comes to daylight. And somewhere along the way, you assumed that God moved on. I've had seasons where I felt like that too, like God decided my story wasn't worth telling anymore. But Abraham wasn't written out. Moses wasn't written out. The crowd who shouted for Jesus' crucifixion wasn't written out. And you're not written out either. Your story isn't finished, and Jesus isn't finished with you. So here's your invitation. Bring him the chapter you're in. Not the polished version, this one. The chapter you're embarrassed by. The chapter you wish you could delete. Because the same Jesus who fulfilled Israel's story is the one who's carrying yours. And not from a distance, but from inside of it. Your story isn't carried by your strength. It's carried and fulfilled in Jesus. And Jesus isn't finished with you yet. Thanks for joining me. I'll see you next time.